Now we're going to be jumping to 18th century politics, so we'll go through this really quickly. 18th century politics to the 1700s. We've already discussed the Enlightenment, so that's the intellectual trend going on during this time period. So what's going on in politics? Now, before this period, we've discussed the rise of centralized governments, absolutist governments in France, and centralized governments in the East, in Prussia, and Russia, and Austria. So that's where we're going to pick up in this discussion. Now, I wrote Pragmatic 2 down there. Basically, this is picking up with our discussion of the Pragmatic Sanction, which we discussed before. The Pragmatic Sanction was created by Charles VI of Austria, so that when he died, all the Habsburg possessions would go to his daughter, Maria Theresa. He dies in 1740. When he dies, all the Habsburg possessions, according to the Pragmatic Sanction, should go to his daughter. However, not everyone follows it. Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great, he, in 1740, invades with his Prussian army. He invades and seizes Silesia, this territory that Austria has controlled. This sets off the War of Austrian Succession. Now, the War of Austrian Succession will feature then, on the one hand, Austria versus Prussia. They will be fighting. Now, Austria's historic arch-rival, the kingdom with which the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburg Emperor, has had the largest feud for the last 2 centuries, has been whom? France, right? This historic animosity between the Germans and the French. The Germans, the Habsburgs, and the French. So the French are going to aid Prussia. Now, we have a rival, a geopolitical rivalry between France and what other overseas power? Britain. Okay? So Britain is going to aid the side of the Austrians, and these are our 2 sides in the conflict. Now, on the continent, the battle is going to be, so I'll put in red on here the battle in land, and then in blue will be the battle overseas. On land, the battle will be between Austria and Prussian France. Overseas, the battle will be between Britain and France. They will be fighting, and they will be fighting. So France is pulled between its continental army and its overseas naval battles. And that's actually hurts it in the mid-18th century. Now, the result of this conflict is the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And this treaty in 1748 basically says, we will return to how we were before the war. So there is no real winners. In Latin, it's status quo ante bellum. Status quo ante bellum. Status quo, it's a situation from before the war, ante bellum. Except with one bold exception. Prussia keeps Silesia. And so this will mean Prussia will keep a large territory with many Germans and with a huge economic base. It will be a rich, prosperous, and highly populated territory that will go to Prussia, which will make Prussia a bigger country. So now we will see the diplomatic revolution happen. And the diplomatic revolution is another historian's term that describes the dramatic change in alliances in the middle of the 18th century. Austria realizes that if it's going to survive against a stronger Prussia, it needs a better ally than Britain, which doesn't really have a strong army at all. And so Austria is going to make overtures to France to become allies. And so that is the diplomatic revolution. Austria and France are now allies. This is unheard of because Austria and France have been historic enemies. The Habsburgs and the French kings, historic enemies going back over the entirety of this course, right? Back to the 1500s, when Francis I and Charles V are competing for influence in Europe. When Francis I is aiding the Lutherans against Charles V, and when their two sides, the Habsburgs and the French, are fighting down in Italy. They've been rivals this whole time. But now they are allies. Why? Because they both see a new power to fear. And that new power to fear is Prussia. Now, Prussia will feel isolated. And so Prussia will have a new ally, and that new ally will be Britain. Austria and France are going to want to remove the threat of Prussia. Austria wants Silesia back. And so in 1756 we have the beginning of the 7 Years' War. And so once again we'll have the same issue on the continent. Austria and France will be fighting, but now on the same side against Prussia. But once again, overseas, we'll have France and Britain fighting. But notice how their dance partners have changed. That's the diplomatic revolution. The 7 Years' War then goes from 1756 to 1763. And what is the result of it? The result is that Prussia survives and Britain wins. So this side wins the war. For Prussia, they are able to survive the joint attack of Austria and France. And Britain is able to become the dominant overseas colonial force. Britain will win in North America, where the conflict is known as the French and Indian War, because we, the Americans, the British colonists, are fighting against the French and Indians. So Britain will win in North America, and therefore we'll get Canada, we'll get the Ohio River Valley and the areas along the Mississippi, up to the Mississippi. And secondly, Britain will win battles in India as well. And so Britain will dominate India and will colonize India then over the next century. And the treaty that ends the war is the Treaty of Paris. And that is that's a treaty between France and Britain that ends the conflict and gives Britain these gains. And this is important long-term because now Britain will be the dominant naval power. For when Napoleon rolls around, they'll still be the dominant naval power, which will have an effect on France's ability to dominate the continent because the British will blockade Napoleon. And they'll cut off the continental trade with overseas areas.